This is the second part of my series on how to get into collecting nice books. Today, I'll focus in particular on understanding the shape of the nice book landscape and what different options might be out there. Now, if you're interested in collecting the work of a particular author, or perhaps you have a particular favorite book that you'd just like a really nice copy of, then in some ways your life is easy. All you need to do is figure out what is the best edition of that particular work. And then a great starting point would be to go to the forums over at LibraryThing, either to ask about that or just to observe the conversation there, and you'll learn a lot about the options that are available. But if you're serious about collecting nice books, at some point you're going to have to understand what are the publishers that are out there and what do their catalogues look like. And so that will be the main topic of today. And I'm going to divide those publishers into 4 categories. Those are publishers of affordable modern long-form editions, modern fine press long-form editions, modern private presses, and classic private presses. I should say that the lines between these categories are blurry, but I think they help to organize the vast variety of things that are out there. My plan is to give a pretty broad overview of what to expect from these categories and just some examples of the publishers in each to help you start your search. Of course, I can't mention all of the publishers that are out there, but if you spend a little bit of time hanging around those LibraryThing forums, you'll soon pick up an intuition for the range of options that are available. So let's start with affordable modern long-form editions. These are publishers who publish long-form works such as novels or the type of non-fiction book you might find at a local bookstore, but just to a much higher standard of production, as I covered in the first video. Probably the most entry-level examples of nice books would be something like Everyman's Library or Library of America. These are not publishers that produce exceptionally beautiful books. Typically, they're not illustrated. The materials are not of the highest quality, but they're a definite step up from the type of bookstore trade edition that you might otherwise encounter, and are a perfectly respectable way to build a collection of nice reading copies of great works. But if we go seriously into the world of nice books, probably the most common entry point for most collectors is going to be the Folio Society. This is a British publisher that was established in 1947 by Charles Eade with the stated mission of publishing editions of the world's great literature in a format worthy of the contents and at a price within the reach of every man. Because the press has been active since 1947, it has a long back catalogue which encompasses many examples of the world's great literature, both fiction and non-fiction, although there's a definite Western bias, particularly in the earlier years of the press's output. The press remains active and recent offerings continue in the tradition established earlier, but often now covering also more modern mainstream works. And certainly in the last decade or two, we've started to see works from genres like science fiction, fantasy, young adult, popular science being published by the Folio Society, whereas in the past they constrained themselves more routinely to classics. Generally, these Folio Society editions will be illustrated, usually with original illustrations commissioned specifically for the edition, and they will always have a proper sewn binding. Usually they're also slipcased and will be printed on a reasonably decent archival paper. Earlier books published by the Folio Society were printed letterpress because that was standard practice at the time, but now they're generally printed by digital offset. Another thing to say is that the designs have become a bit more adventurous over time. So whereas earlier Folio Society editions would have the look of a fairly reserved classic book, now we get a lot more vibrancy and boldness in the way the covers are designed, a lot more experimentation in the way illustrations are presented in the book. And depending on your taste, this may be either a good or a bad thing, but it certainly makes those books pretty popular among modern collectors. Some have bemoaned the apparently escalating prices of Folio Society editions in recent years. Nowadays, a typical Folio Society book will cost somewhere between £50 and £100. That's between about $60 and $120 US. but I emphasize that they have a large back catalogue, many of which can be bought at really quite attractive prices on the secondary market, and that can be a great way to build very quickly a respectable collection. Because the Folio Society is based in the UK and ships its books from the UK, the cost of shipping to countries further afield does add to the expense. The company holds sales a couple of times a year, but the biggest, most popular titles generally don't go on sale. As well as their standard editions, the Folio Society also publishes on a fairly regular cadence limited editions of both fiction and non-fiction works. These are a definite step up the price ladder, starting from perhaps a couple of £100 and ranging up to somewhere around the £1,000 mark. They represent often decent editions, but certainly not in the same league of quality as some of the other categories of book that I will discuss later in this video. The last thing I'd say about the Folio Society is that over at LibraryThing, there's a dedicated forum called Folio Society Devotees, which is very active and a great place to learn more about that press. Another great source of these modern long-form nice editions is the George Macy companies. These started in 1929 when George Macy founded a company called the Limited Editions Club. Although that's a long time ago, I still call these books modern because they extend into the modern era and they laid the template that later publishers like the Folio Society would follow. As the name implies, the Limited Editions Club published limited editions, normally with an edition of 1,500 copies of fine books. In many ways, they're similar to the Folio Society, but my view is that the Limited Editions Club books have a substantially better construction. As well as being limited, these books are generally going to be signed by the illustrator. They were printed letterpress, and they employed serious artisanal printing shops to do the printing for many of the editions. If you're based in the US, the Limited Editions Club offers a real treat because these books are comparatively affordable despite the fact that these are signed limited editions. If you're not based in the US, these books can be harder to come by and you may have to ship them from the US, which can add to the expense. But still, you will often be getting a very high quality of book at a comparatively low price, so it can be another great way to build a collection. From the early 1980s onwards, the Limited Editions Club started publishing higher-end editions in lower limitations, and they command considerably higher prices than the books that were published in the 70s and earlier. In 1935, George Macy founded another publisher. The basic business model of the Heritage Press was to take the editions of the Limited Editions Club and reprint them in slightly cheaper, non-limited versions, sometimes with compromises like reproducing the illustrations in monochrome rather than colour, a slight downgrade in paper or materials. But generally, these Heritage Press books were of a good quality and certainly compare favourably with modern editions like those from the Folio Society. One thing to note about the Heritage Press is that they at some point relocated their offices from New York to Connecticut. The general consensus is that around that time, the general quality of the books decreased a little bit. In any case, the prices of these Heritage Press books on the used market are scandalously low. So again, Heritage Press books can be a really nice way to affordably build a collection of nice books. The rights to Heritage Press titles were bought by Easton Press, which continues to publish them in new editions, along with editions of their own design, usually bound in leather, and those Easton Press editions are another common entry point into collecting for those interested in nice books. Just like the Folio Society, the George Macy companies have their own dedicated LibraryThing forum, which again is very active and a great source of information. Now I want to jump to the very opposite end of the nice book universe and talk about classic private press. So in 1888, Emery Walker was giving a lecture to the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, and that lecture is probably the reason that we're all here. In the audience was William Morris, who was inspired to set up the Kelmscott Press 2 years later. That marked the start of the so-called private press movement, which saw one or two proprietors doing their own printing and sometimes binding by hand. It was a rejection of the industrialization of book production in favour of fine materials, fine printing and fine design. At the centre of it all was type, and it was common for those early presses to have their own type designed and cast into metal. They published whatever was of interest to the proprietors of the press, so the selection of these early private press publishers can be eclectic and often quite eccentric. The core foundation of the early private press movement was a collection of 3 publishers known as the Triple Crown. That is William Morris's Kelmscott Press, St John Hornby's Ashendene Press, and Emery Walker and Cobden Sanderson's Doves Press. Those books are very sought after because they combine very high standards of book design and book production with the historical importance of playing a founding role in this movement of fine book production. Also in the early wave of the private press movement here in England was work by the Daniel Press, Vale Press, Iragny Press and Essex House Press. A second wave of British private presses started up around 1920 and ran at least until the 60s and often further up towards the turn of the millennium. That second wave included publishers like the Golden Cockerel Press, the Gregginog Press, Shakespeare Head Press, Nonsuch Press, or Cresset Press. This second wave coincided with the establishment of the Society of Wood Engravers in 1920 and saw the primacy of wood engraving in the publishing of their editions. In any case, these early private presses typically restricted their output to shorter works, mostly because of the practicalities of printing them by hand press. They often used highly tactile papers that may feel a bit coarse and unrefined by today's standards, but are a real pleasure to handle. However, because of the historic significance of these books, they can get quite expensive. The most accessible examples, which might be some of the lesser works from the likes of the Golden Cockerel Press, can be bought for under £100, but the cornerstone works of the Kelmscott, Doves and Ashendene presses can go well up into 5 figures. The movement started here in the UK, but there was also a flourishing of private presses elsewhere. For example, Weimar Germany had its own great presses, such as the Cranach Press and the Bremer Presse. Meanwhile, in the US, the Grabhorn Press was getting established in San Francisco. If you're interested in this more global perspective on private presses, I again recommend going to LibraryThing and visiting the Fine Press Forum, where there are experts on the full gamut of what is out there. That brings us on to modern private presses, which, as the name implies, continue the traditions laid down by those classic private presses into the modern day. Just like the earlier presses, they continue to operate as small 1 or 2 man operations, printing by traditional letterpress methods on fine papers in small print runs with high quality bindings. They also continue the practice of often printing wood engravings and focusing on the finer points of book design. They also publish a similarly eclectic mix encompassing the likes of artist books, poetry, and shorter form original texts. By their nature, there's a very large number of small private presses scattered all around the world, and I'll put a non-exhaustive list of some examples on the screen that could be a good place to start your search. But again, going to the Fine Press Forum over at LibraryThing will be a great way to learn about the full scope. Just as diverse of the range of the types of books that these private presses publish is the range of prices available. But you can expect anything from £50 up to several £1,000s, with a budget of around £100 to £200 being a pretty good starting point. Another thing to know about modern private press is that it's common to offer books in a variety of states. That is to say, different versions of the same edition that may vary in their binding materials or the paper that's used or what extras are included. Our final category is modern fine press long form. There's been a bit of a renaissance in fine press publishing in recent years, with a flowering of new publishers that produce fine press editions of longer form titles like novels. But these are distinguished from the long form works we began with by a greater focus on artisanal materials, letterpress printing, a very high standard of book production, but with correspondingly much higher prices. These are publishers that often combine traditional bookcraft with more modern tastes, including a focus on publishing modern titles, often from genres such as horror, science fiction, or fantasy. These modern fine press long-form books could be further subdivided into two categories. The first I'd call long-form private press. These are presses that do operate very much like other private presses insofar as they have their own printing facilities and they may also do their own binding. Typical publishers of such books would include the likes of Arion Press, Hand and Eye, or Thornwillow Press. The other type of publisher of long-form fine press editions follows in the footsteps of George Macy and casts the publisher in the role of coordinator. They secure the necessary property rights to publish a work, conceive and design the book, but typically outsource all of the production from printing, illustration, binding, and perhaps even type design to other organizations. Prices for these books are typically similar to their private press equivalents, that is to say, anywhere from £100 up to several £1,000s, and like the private press books, they're often issued in multiple states. In no small part because of their willingness to publish modern editions of popular titles, publisher coordinators often find their output to be oversubscribed. Many therefore operate a so-called rights model where the right of first refusal to purchase is offered to those who've bought previous editions from the publisher. I'll put some examples of this type of publisher on the screen, and again, going to the Fine Press forum over at LibraryThing is a great way to learn about more. So that's a quick overview of the landscape of nice books. I hope it helped to give you some ideas of where you could begin your own search for that next book to add to your collection. In the next video in this series, I'll be taking a look at how to get the most out of some of the online tools that we use to find nice books to buy. If you're interested in that, do subscribe and join me next time.